name is Leif Asmark Jensen. I was a little surprised when you suddenly in the debates start questioning, is this debate at all important? I've never been to a debate where some of the debaters start questioning if the topic is important or not. So I actually have a question. Can you give some examples of what you consider important in your life, and then give us a reason why is that important at all?
Well, I think here's some important questions. Should we do more to relieve suffering in the third world? Should we, in what way can our lives be said to be meaningful, to have a meaning? In what way is morality binding? Why should we be moral beings? These are important questions. Of course, you might then say, well, the question of God links to all these questions. But actually, that's one of the things I find really puzzling. I mean, hearing this explanation about how the world came about, why exactly does it show that morality is binding? That you ought to be a moral person? I mean, you hear this story about how the universe was created 6 billion years ago by a bodiless mind that created an act of will. Why does that show that you ought to be a moral being? There's a large number of steps missing here. As we all, maybe you have an explanation, but you know, I mean, I think that the question of why we ought to be moral beings is a very, very important one, and has been discussed immensely in philosophy. Most philosophers who have discussed that question since Kant and before that have not resorted to the traditional view of saying that we ought to be moral beings because God has laid down the moral rules and he'll punish us if we are not moral beings. That's one traditional answer, of course, but it's an answer which most philosophers have not accepted, though of course some have, so it's a matter of controversy. But these are important questions.
Yeah. So why do you think they're important? Why do you think it's important to minimize suffering in the third world? Why do you think it's important to have moral issues? Why? Well,
now you're sort of imputing things I didn't say. I said it's an important question whether we should do it. Big question, you know. Don't you think so? I mean, don't you think that's an important question?
I'm asking you.
I think it's important because, well, I think human suffering and human happiness is important. If you're asking me to give a kind of presuppositionless argument that terminates in the conclusion that human suffering is important, then I think that's actually pretty difficult. So I'm very convinced that human suffering is important, but it's hard to come up with a non-question begging argument that human suffering is important. And now you're smiling because now I need God. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think this is a genuine philosophical issue that we ought to think about. And when we think about it seriously, then, I mean, I don't find myself consoled by trying to address that very important problems by simply saying there's this very obscure being that is explaining all this.
Thank you.
Anybody who doesn't think that the question of the existence of God is important, I think needs to take a heavy dose of French existentialist philosophy. Read the atheist French philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who thought that in the absence of God, life is absurd, without meaning, value, or purpose. I have never read a more poignant description of the human predicament than in the writings of authors like these. Or Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God and predicted the advent of nihilism once this realization was widespread. I think these authors provide a very, very gripping analysis of the human predicament in the absence of God, and therefore it's just absolutely vital that each of us think hard about this question, because every day we wake up, we answer by how we live, whether or not we think objective moral values exist, there's meaning in life, there's purpose to my existence, and so forth. These questions are unavoidable.
Thank you. And do we have another question over here? Yes?
Good evening. I'm Morten. And yes, you just said that the question of whether God exists is an important one.
Could you tip that?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
and an essential one. And I fail to see that. So could
I need you to enunciate a little more clearly.
Okay, so I fail to see why is the question whether God exists an important or essential question. Could you give a dumbed-down version of why is that?
Yeah, yes. Why is it important? Well, because let's assume that the God of Christian theism exists. That means that there is a creator of the universe who loves you, who is absolute goodness, and who wants to bring you into a relationship with himself forever, an inexhaustible, incommensurable good. It would be the fulfillment of human existence. It means there's a purpose for which you were created. God has a purpose for you to fulfill in this life. And it means that human beings are intrinsically morally valuable and that you have moral obligations to fulfill, such as loving your neighbor as yourself and helping to alleviate human suffering. So there are profound implications if this is true. Now, on the other hand, if atheism is true, then it's very hard to see why there's any purpose in life. On atheism, the universe is destined to extinction in the heat death of the universe. As the universe expands, all the stars and the galaxies will burn out, and matter will degenerate into black holes and dead stars. There will be no light, there will be no life, there will be no heat, only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies expanding into the endless night. It will be a universe in ruins. There is no purpose for which the universe exists, no purpose for which you exist. Moreover, there's no meaning to your life, ultimately. It doesn't matter what you do, because whatever you do will all end up the same, in extinction. And it's hard to see on naturalism why there would be any objective moral values, why people would have intrinsic value. We're just basically relatively advanced primates, which have evolved on this speck of solar dust called planet Earth, and it's hard to see why you would have an obligation to love other primates of your species, or to do them good, or not to act in your self-interest in certain cases. So these lead to just radically different views of how you will live your life, depending on whether or not God exists.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, you can. It's fine with you. Okay, you can make
Okay.
a short
Thank
comment.
you.
Yes.
Your argument is you're appealing to feelings, right?
No, no, goodness
well,
sake.
okay. Can I continue?
How is talking about the heat death of the universe and the
Yes,
extinction
yes.
of the human race
So
appeal to feelings? That's a scientific fact about how things are going to end up.
I believe that. What I meant was that I fail to follow your argument because I think that I should feel a void inside me if God doesn't exist.
You should what?
Feel a void inside of me.
Well, now that's an appeal to feelings. You're the one appealing to feelings, not me. You should feel a void, and you don't.
Sorry?
You say you should feel a void, and you apparently don't.
I don't, because, what if there's nobody loving me? Well, most of the time I love me, and if I don't, then my family does, and my friends. So I don't see the necessity for God through that. I should feel that there's a need for God. It seems to be your argument.
I don't know. I mean, Nietzsche said that people may not feel the need for God because they can render themselves oblivious to this. Pascal said the same thing. By occupying ourselves with activities and entertainment, we don't think of the absurdity of life and the meaninglessness that surrounds us. I think it takes serious philosophical reflection on these matters to realize them, and the mass of humanity often don't pause to seriously think about the implications if there is no God, or if there is a God. But they're vastly different, as I think I illustrated. And so whether you feel a void or not is more a matter of your personal psychology than whether or not these worldviews have drastically different implications for human beings.
Thank you very much. Comment.
I'd like to comment on it. I mean, so the question is, why is the question whether God exists important at all? And one view that explains why it's important is if you think that the existence of God explains that there's a meaning to life, that morality exists, objective morality exists, you really ought to be moral, that there's an afterlife and all that. So if you assume a number of things about God, then that will also explain why the question about God is important. That's fine. But then in your comments, Craig, you also said that that it also goes the other way, that if you don't assume that God exists, then you can't explain meaning of life. You can't explain morality. And the whole thing becomes a kind of sort of existentialist nightmare. I don't agree about that at all. I mean, it's a long-standing project in philosophy to explain morality, for one thing. That's probably the primary thing that people have been preoccupied with. Explaining morality without appealing to God. Kant, for example, was a firm believer in God. But he had this very interesting project of explaining morality without appealing to God. And, this is controversial whether Kant succeeds in this, but it's just one of many, many projects. And the sort of brisk idea that without God we can't explain these things, that's just not true. I mean, it's up in the air.
Thank you.